A strip of dried salmon curls over a bed of gray coals, dark red at the edges, still hours from finished. Picture losing every grocery store, every tap, every flashlight you own, all at once, and getting handed 6 days on a stretch of Alaska loaded with more food per square mile than almost anywhere else on the continent, and still coming within an afternoon of running on empty. That's not a worst case dreamed up for a video. That's day one of this trip. And the reason has nothing to do with how much food is actually out there. It has everything to do with how fast a person can be wrong about reaching it, and how little margin this coastline actually leaves for finding that out the hard way. I've spent enough seasons cross-checking this coast against the old traders' journals to know exactly how that happens. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what it takes to eat, drink, build fire, and get out of here in one piece with nothing but a knife and a raft. And exactly where a plan like that nearly fails. There's no road into this delta, and none out of it, and no one coming in behind me. The only way home is a float plane on a fixed pickup day, agreed a week in advance, with no way to call it early. And still, on 6 days alone with no food and no water carried in, it's entirely possible to go 3 of them without a single real calorie. The actual shape of this coastline, and getting the timing wrong here, nearly cost the only way out of it entirely. That part comes later. 2 things here can kill faster than hunger: open flame and cold water, and neither forgives being treated casually. Every fire gets set on bare gravel, clear of anything nearby that could carry it, never left unwatched. Every trip onto the water assumes a fall in, and glacial melt this cold. That's the only honest way to plan it. Here's the puzzle worth sitting with. How does a place this loaded with food still come within a hard afternoon of starving someone who knows what they're doing? The answer isn't hidden in the water or the fish. It's hidden in timing. And the record of who understood that doesn't come from one tidy source. Records kept by Hudson's Bay Company posts on this coast describe long stretches of nothing, followed by sudden abundance the moment a run arrived. That record shouldn't be confused with interior fur trade country further south, built around different pressures: game density, snowpack, overland travel between forts. Coastal Alaska runs on tide tables and salmon timing instead, and the two don't transfer. That 15-minute mistake costing the only way home is still waiting further down this story. What comes first is simpler, and just as capable of ending the trip early. The water everybody assumes is the easy part. The first test isn't food, it's water, and it solves fast. Which is what makes it dangerous to get wrong. No filter, no tablets, just a glacial stream running pale gray-green with rock flour, cold enough to ache in the teeth. The rule isn't the silt, it's where the water's drawn from. Moving current, away from beaverback pools, offshore of where sediment collects. Glacial melt carries almost none of the buildup that makes still water dangerous, and UV light breaks down cryptosporidium and giardia on contact with sun-exposed current. A probability, not a guarantee. The only way to lose that bet is impatience. A boot placed carelessly in the shallows, stirring the bottom right before filling a bottle. The water didn't fail. The 2 seconds before drinking it did. If you had to fill a bottle from a stream you'd never seen before, right now, would you know which few feet of it to trust? Answer honestly in the comments and tell me if anyone in your family ever lived without running water. There's a lot more of this coastline to get through, starting with the fire that almost didn't happen. Getting to that water is its own test first. Getting to that stream in the first place means moving through terrain that punishes anyone who stops paying attention to it. This stretch of coast grows devil's club, chest high in the wet ground, under the tree line. A plant armored in spines from root to leaf that draws blood through a glove without much effort, tangled in with ferns tall enough to swallow a person to the shoulder. There's no trail through most of it, just a general direction and a hope that the ground underneath holds. It's in that kind of cover that gear disappears without anyone noticing. A tripod lashed to the top of a pack slips loose somewhere in a few hundred yards of shoulder-deep fern, and it's gone before the next rest stop, buried in undergrowth, thick enough to hide it a foot from where it fell. The discipline that actually prevents that loss isn't a better knot. It's a checkmate at every single stop. Gear counted by hand before moving again. Because in country this dense, a mistake doesn't announce itself. It just quietly stays behind. Fire is where the trip almost stalls out for good. Fire here doesn't cooperate the way it should, and understanding why matters more than any tool in the pack. A hand-carved bow drill spins for over an hour against a hearth board cut from standing timber, building real heat, real smoke, and still nothing catches. The char collecting in the notch isn't the fine black powder that means an ember is close. It's pilly, waxy, almost gummy between the fingers. That texture is the tell. And it means one thing: the wood is still holding water deep in its fiber, and no amount of additional friction fixes that. The moisture has to leave first, and in a rainforest averaging over 100 inches of rain a year, standing timber rarely lets it. The fix isn't more effort on the same wood, it's driftwood. Sun-bleached, salt-cured, wrung dry by months of tide cycling, in a way no standing tree in this climate ever gets wrung. Same hearthboard technique, different material, and the ember comes in minutes instead of never. There's a habit worth naming plainly here, because the survival gear industry sells directly against it. The idea that one expensive tool, bought once, replaces the need to understand the material it's working on. A single high-end fire starter, a single filter rated for every water source on Earth, marketed as the only purchase a person needs to make. That framing isn't a conspiracy, it's arithmetic. A single product sold to solve every version of a problem is easier to market than teaching someone to read wet wood versus dry driftwood, and there's no dollar in admitting no single tool survives every failure this coastline throws at it. The actual answer here isn't expensive, it's redundant, and it's cheap. A bow drill kit, worth the hour it takes to build, backed by a lighter that costs less than a cup of coffee, a folding knife for fine work, and a saw for anything the knife can't handle, rather than one heavy blade asked to do both badly. None of that requires a specialized purchase. It requires carrying two ways to solve the same problem and knowing which one to reach for first. That's not a modern insight dressed up as an old one either. Coastal travelers working this exact country a century and a half ago carried the same layered logic without ever calling it redundancy. A working method backed by a slower, more certain one, because a single failed technique in 100 inches of annual rain wasn't an inconvenience, it was the whole trip. Fire solves faster than food does. That same misreading almost repeats itself with food, except food doesn't forgive a wasted afternoon the way firewood does. At low tide, the exposed rocks here are stacked with blue mussels, easy to twist free by hand, and ropes of bladderwrack cling to the same stone a few feet up the beach. Both edible, neither filling. The meat inside each mussel shell is barely a mouthful, and it takes hundreds of them to approach a single real meal before the tide reclaims the whole buffet in a few hours. There's a real danger folded into that abundance. Shellfish along parts of this coast can carry paralytic shellfish poisoning, a toxin produced by algae blooms that concentrates in filter feeders and survives cooking completely intact. Checking local shellfish advisories before twisting a single mussel free isn't a suggestion. The same coastline that feeds a person can shut down a nervous system if the wrong bloom passed through that week, so the shellfish buy time. They don't solve the problem. That's why the river has to eventually produce, whether it wants to on schedule or not. The river doesn't answer just because you show up. 2 full days pass with lines in that river and nothing to show for it, not even a strike. Salmon holding in current this late in a run aren't feeding the way they do at sea. Their focus has shifted almost entirely to spawning, and a fly drifted past their mouth gets ignored outright, no matter how well it's tied. The technique that finally works isn't a lure choice at all. It's a mechanical fact of fish biology Alaskan anglers call flossing. A salmon holding in current constantly opens and closes its mouth to pass water across its gills, and a line drifted at the right depth can slide into that open mouth on the exhale and pull tight across the jaw on the next closing motion. No bait needed, no interest from the fish required, just timing against a reflex the fish can't override. Finding the right water matters just as much as the technique. Salmon staging before a push-up river hold in the slack water behind a boulder, along the slower inside curve of a bend, or in a deep eddy where the main flow peels away and leaves a calmer pocket behind it. Reading the surface for that subtle break in current speed, rather than blind casting into the loudest water, is what separates a hole that holds fish from 100 yards of river that doesn't. The sockeye that finally comes out of one of those eddies turns 2 days of nothing into the entire calorie base for the rest of the trip. And it proves the puzzle from the start of this story. The fish were there the whole time. Getting one required understanding what they were actually doing, not just showing up with the right rod. Once that fish is out of the water, the work is only half finished, and most of the real calories haven't even been touched yet. The fillets go towards strips for smoking, built to survive days of travel without spoiling. But the head and cheeks, thrown away without a second thought on most dinner plates, hold the densest fat on the entire animal, packed around the jaw muscle and behind the eye socket. On a trip with no resupply coming, that fat is the highest calorie bite on the whole river, and leaving it on the gravel bar is the same mistake as leaving food behind in a pack that's already too light. This whole trip has been watched the entire time. None of this happens in isolation either. Fresh scat turns up 6 separate times along 2 miles of trail, several piles fresh enough to be measured in hours, not days. An honest measure of how many bears this run supports, not a warning sign to panic over. Once fish are cleaned and hung to smoke, camp moves 50 yards upwind of the rack on purpose, putting distance and airflow between where a person sleeps and where the smell of drying protein concentrates. If something comes to investigate overnight, it investigates an empty stretch of gravel, not a sleeping bag. A black bear does show up one morning, working the brush across the river, drawn by drifting smoke. And the right response to that isn't panic. It's confirmation the system worked. Distance and wind discipline did the job before the bear ever got close enough to matter. A black bear holding interest from that range is a manageable situation, noise and presence enough to move it along. A brown bear doing the same thing is a different calculation entirely, one where the safer answer is often patience and distance rather than confrontation. Smoke isn't the only thing the wind gives away. Reading wind on this delta earns its keep well beyond the smoker. In a valley like this, air tends to drain downhill overnight as the ground cools, then reverses and pushes back upriver once the sun warms the lower ground again. A shift that happens on a schedule as reliable as the tide, if less talked about. A camp set upwind of a smoking rack in the evening can find itself downwind of it by morning if that reversal isn't accounted for, and the same shift changes which direction a bear working a scent trail is actually likely to approach from. Reading which way the air is moving and knowing that direction will flip before sunrise is as much a part of reading this country as reading a stream or a tide chart. There's a factor working against every decision made on this trip that has nothing to do with bears, tides, or fire, and almost never gets mentioned. The sun barely sets this far north in summer. It circles low instead of dropping below the horizon, dipping into a kind of twilight sometime near midnight before climbing again a few hours later. Real darkness never arrives, and neither does the clear signal a body normally uses to know when to stop for the day. That constant half-light adds up fast, and the sleep debt compounds across 6 days of hiking, paddling, and standing in cold water. Judgment is one of the first things measurably affected by accumulated sleep loss. Not dramatically, but enough to shift a borderline call toward the easier answer instead of the more careful one. A patch of gravel that would get a second look on day 1 can look solid enough on day 4 without a second thought, simply because the mind evaluating it is running on less than it thinks it is. 6 days and none of it comes closer to going wrong than this. All of that discipline, and the closest call of the entire 6 days still comes down to 15 minutes and a stretch of gravel that looked dry enough to trust. A short walk down the beach to scout a campsite. The pack raft pulled up on ground well above the waterline by eye. 15-20 minutes exploring a point further along the shore. On the walk back, the raft is gone from where it was left. The tide in this part of the sound doesn't creep in. It arrives fast, driven by the same glacial melt and channel geometry that reshapes this whole delta twice a day. Tidal swings along this stretch of coast can run 15 feet or more between low and high water, and a beach that reads as a wide, dry margin at low tide can be entirely underwater within a handful of hours. Ground that looks safe with a comfortable margin turned out to be well inside the tide's reach within a single cycle, and the only reason this trip continues is that wind happened to push the drifting raft into a shallow cove instead of open water. That's luck, not a plan. A tide table sitting in a pocket the whole time would have shown exactly how many vertical feet of beach were about to vanish, and exactly when. The information existed. It just wasn't checked because the ground looked dry enough not to bother. Lose that raft in a place with no roads and no resupply, and 6 days alone becomes a multi-day walkout through bare, dense, alder-choked wilderness, with no food reserve built up yet, and no one within 100 miles to notice the raft is missing before the pickup date arrives. That's the version of this story that doesn't end with a clean pickup. That's also the real answer to the puzzle planted at the start. This coastline was never actually short on food. It was short on margin for a mistake in reading it. A hearth board that looked dry and wasn't. Gear that looked secure in the fern and wasn't. A wind that would flip direction by morning without announcing it. A gravel bar that looked safe and wasn't. Every one of them a small misjudgment, made a little easier by 6 days of never quite getting dark enough to properly rest. The strip of salmon curling over the coals at the beginning of this story didn't come from abundance. It came from 3 days of getting that reading right just often enough, and one afternoon of getting lucky when it wasn't. None of this should be mistaken for a formula that always works. The shellfish risk on this coast is real and specific to conditions that shift week to week. Safe on one beach doesn't mean safe on the next. Drinking untreated glacial water carries genuine risk of illness, even when the odds favor a clean outcome. It worked out on this trip, and it hasn't always worked out on others in country like this. And the tide near miss wasn't a lesson earned through skill. It was a decision that should have gone differently, saved by wind that happened to blow the right way that afternoon. A different wind tells a very different story, and no amount of experience changes that math. There's one more limit worth stating outright. Glacial water. This cold turns a pack raft capsize into a medical emergency, far faster than the distance to shore would suggest. Cold water pulls heat out of a body dozens of times faster than cold air, and the window between an unplanned swim and real hypothermia can be measured in minutes, not hours. None of the food or fire knowledge in this story changes that math either. Staying out of that water in the first place is the only reliable version of this plan. Trade a shelf of groceries and a running tap for 6 days on this coast, and the constant background math of where the next meal comes from switches back on fast. It isn't romantic, it's just work. Timed against tides and driftwood and the moisture sitting inside a piece of wood that looks dry from the outside. And the relief that shows up once the food finally sorts itself out doesn't exist without the scarcity that came first. This coast isn't finished giving up what it knows, and neither is this story.